Welcome back to Outsiders. I'm James Morrow here with Rowan Dean and Rita Panahy, and I've got a little story for you today about how so much of the continuing crisis in America is not a race war, but rather a generational war. One fought between an older generation that, no matter their politics, understood that the battle of ideas is contentious and sometimes uncomfortable. And a younger generation brought up on victimology, identity politics, critical race theory, and above all, a culture of safety-ism, where your supposed right to never feel uncomfortable stops everyone else's rights to free speech, free thought, and free inquiry. There was a great example of this week at the New York Times, the so-called Gray Lady, America's paper of record, when they published an op-ed this week by Senator Tom Cotton, entitled "Send in the Troops," which called for the president to invoke his authority under the Insurrection Act to quell rioting and civil disorder, not peaceful protests, mind you, in states where the local, generally Democrat governors and mayors had failed to do so. In that piece, Cotton wrote that, quote, "One thing above all else will restore order to our streets: an overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers." Contentious? Maybe. Dangerous? Hardly. Yet, for as much as the word is overused, the article by Tom Cotton triggered a mass meltdown of snowflakes across the New York Times newsroom, and it prompted a coordinated campaign from dozens of its young journalists, though frankly I'm not sure they're worthy of that name, who all spent the day tweeting the offending article with the words, "Running this puts Black New York Times staff in danger." Amazingly, their actions did not prompt editors to tell them to pull their heads in or hit the bricks. Instead, their bosses at the New York Times caved. And it was announced that the op-ed published online would not run in print editions of the paper, and that to avoid future controversy, the paper would publish less opinion in the paper. Of course, the rank hypocrisy of these outraged, mollycoddled mini-Maoists, to say nothing of their editors, stank as badly as a New York City garbage scow at the height of summer. The New York Times has published op-eds from far greater monsters than Tom Cotton, including Turkish dictator Recep Erdogan, as well as from the Taliban. Look, in 1941, they even published an excerpt from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, months after the Blitz, while the war raged in Europe, so that Americans could better understand the Nazis' propaganda war against them. No one back then complained that such an act was putting Jews or Poles or Britons or Frenchmen or Belgians or, well, you get the idea, at risk. Oh, and here's my favorite. In 2014, they published this number under the headline, wait for it, "Pedophilia, a disorder, not a crime." Really? Again, this sailed through not just editorial processes at the New York Times, but past a newsroom full of easily triggered reporters. Even though minimizing child sexual abuse is, at least the way I see it, much more dangerous than cracking down on looters and thugs wrecking America's greatest cities. Call me crazy. The New York Times has also published all manner of fiction masquerading as fact, from the bogus 1619 Project propaganda puff pieces telling us that even the sex was better in the Soviet Union. I guess there's nothing like a day standing on the breadline to get you in the mood for some carefully rationed loving, I tell you what. Anyway, none of this prompted the sort of outrage as the piece by Cotton, a sitting United States senator whose position is shared by a majority of Americans. And as a result of this crybaby performance on the part of the New York Times kidults and the spineless, supine weakness of their bosses, America now has less speech. The mainstream media has even less credibility than it did before. So, well done to all concerned. Your participation certificates are in the mail.